Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar Weekly Discussion topic video. This one is going to be basically my thoughts on why I think that we need going forward more one-off or smaller scale stories than we are getting currently. So jumping straight into the topic, I think a large part of why perhaps the fandom isn't always as active is because the only story content we really have coming out that's in any way expected are the current comics in the current format that they're in. That being, they have to be 3-part stories. They're always 72 pages per story, so it means, 216 pages overall. And I do think a large part of why we oftentimes have to wait so long in between, series is because so much of the work that goes into these comics is fitting them into that structure, that you can't just write an opening part of a comic and be like, yeah, that's the opening part. You have to write it and then be like, oh, we have to fit it into 72 pages. Which is, I think, a large part of the reason why at times it just kind of feels weird in some of the series where, like, yeah, the part 2 in this series doesn't really work that well. Or the final part felt like really rushed because it means that your 2 setup books have to be like an exact certain length, and it has to be the same length as like your finale book. So I do think having that structure helps at times, but I think in a way it causes more kind of issues than it does kind of positive things, and means that there's just so much work that's needed to fit that format. And I think the fact that it's been basically stuck to the entire time, like, I think once or twice we've maybe had a page or 2 extra in a book, but the fact that they feel the need to always stick to it so closely is why we don't really get that great of a variety of story. And it also, I think, just overall means that every story has to be like have a certain amount of scope to it, that we can never really just get a small story that maybe fills in a gap here or fills in a gap there. It always kind of has to be this medium length story where it's not as big as any of the stories from the show, any of the seasons or the story arcs from the show, but it's bigger than just a random tie-in comic like from most other franchises what they have. So it does put us in this opposition where it just feels like this is the stuff we as fans want to see in the comics going forward, because obviously the way Avatar is set up right now, we kind of have these bookmarks in our characters' lives of we followed them from 12 to 14 or 15, basically, with Aang and Toph. And then we have these other moments in their lives that we sort of know about where okay, this is the age that Aang dies at. We know he had kids here, and here, married Katara at whatever time. But it's there's so much stuff to fill in there just in terms of when did these 2 characters get married, when did these 2 characters go to live there, when did this event in that character's life happen, that sticking so closely to the younger side of their lives means that, and with the format that we have of needing it to be 72 pages per book, means it's very difficult to just fit in some of these little moments that we want to see. Will we ever see Aang finding the Sky Bison, the other Sky Bison, that we know is something that happens in between the series? I think that's a story that we sort of should be told at some point. And so, in a way, it kind of points out the fact that the years when we have an Avatar-free comic, I think are often some of the kind of best years for Avatar content, in that we have our usual 3 books a year. We get, a 3-part story, whether that be The Search, The Rift, Smoke and Shadow, North and South, but then you also have this kind of smaller separate story that can tell something very different without needing to be huge, but it's just a kind of nice story. Look at the free comics that we've got. We've got Ty Lee's sisters introduced in Sisters, Sokka Suki relationship stuff in Shells, the first Korra comic, Friends for Life, how Korra met Naga. That's a really good story, and it was a really good piece of story content that we got last year. And I think in a way this year, what we've really missed out on is not having anything like that. Really the best this year outside of the 3 comics was that the Pro Bending Arena Kickstarter revealed some new names for the teams and characters on the teams. Like, that's cool, but it's just barely story content because there's no actual new like information about those characters. It's literally just their name. So that's why I'm kind of like, okay, I almost feel like it should be a thing where we get free comics every year, or what just never seems to be talked about or brought up officially by Dark Horse, by Mike O'Brien and the other creative teams, or even all that much in the fandom, is just, why does it seem like it's almost like this impossible thing that we just get like single issue Avatar comics? Like, why are we kind of almost stuck in this format of having to always be, these kind of 72-page graphic novels? I don't mind that's a format that we have, but it feels like it's so stuck in that we can't do anything else unless it's a free comic and it has to be small. Why can't we just have like a one-shot Avatar comic that focuses on just one thing? I can't see there really being some issue where Nickelodeon doesn't want Avatar to come out in that format. Sales, maybe they're worried about sales, but because comics are available digitally now, and that's such a big part of like the market in a way, I don't really think like availability is all that big of an issue, because obviously single issues would actually make the comics more available, because the problem with the Avatar comics right now is that the digital release of them comes like later than the comic book store release, whereas a single issue, the comic book store release date is the release date digitally and physically for the book, the single issue comic. So that would actually really help things, and I think bring the fandom together a little bit more. And that's why in previous discussion videos, I've obviously talked about kind of some of the stuff I'd like to be done to expand, story content going forward. That being like, I really do think Dark Horse should, if at all possible, try to start their own kind of story. And what I mean by that is that what they're releasing so far is a continuation of Avatar: The Last Airbender, a continuation of Korra. Why not start a story in the Avatar universe in a different time period with their own group of characters, so they're not so heavily linked into the show? They don't have to be like so, what seems to be like heavily like monitored by Nick, by Mike and Brian. Like, obviously involve those people, but because you're choosing your own section of the universe, you're basically making this the full on, this comic is only happening because of Dark Horse Comics, and not like it sort of feels sometimes of just like, these stories feel like they're so involved with like the creative team of like the shows that like it almost doesn't matter who the comic publisher is. Make it be like Dark Horse's Avatar comics going forward, and see what we can do there. And I'd love to see what they do there, because obviously you've got so much opportunity. You could choose just a different avatar, because there's so many avatars that we know by name, but then there's so many that we don't know, and you could go anywhere in the timeline and I think tell an interesting story. Have it be done with single issues, and just see how that works, because I think that's the main problem I have, of just it's never even been like tried with Avatar comics. They've never attempted to just release individual issues like the current Voltron comics, the way they do them. Those ones are done in like 5-part monthly issues, something along those lines. But I suppose with their own story, I'd more be leaning towards like kind of have it just be this really ongoing story covering their own section of the timeline, where maybe it comes out as like it's a 25-26 issue arc or something like that. That'd be a cool thing to have, just to, again, as I said, expand the universe. And then it would also be this kind of proof of like, people just want more Avatar, regardless of if it is or isn't related to the shows or not. And that's why it would then give you the option of like, okay, we know we can sell like normal comics, it doesn't have to be a graphic novel, to people. And then that opens the opportunity to then, do your kind of mini-series type stuff, where like, that's a perfect place to do the like Iroh backstory stuff. It's it then gives you an opportunity to be able to kind of fill in gaps anywhere in the universe that we know, but also just tell stories about new stuff that we're not massively sure about. And I think that's the only real issue, I think, with Avatar comics going right now, is that it really is a little bit of a case of, like, of course, always quality over quantity, but when the quantity is so low, like it is now, the quantity does kind of need to go up just to, in a way, like, meet demands with the fandom and kind of what it wants. Because right now it feels like the books are so separated, they just hit, go away, and it's so long between the next one that it kind of just has to restart over and over again. There's so little continuity, I think, between releases, and that's one of the main issues. And that's why it is kind of I think a very important thing going forward that they sort of plan this out a little bit more. The main thing I've obviously been saying throughout the year is that, okay, you pretty badly, I think, handled the transition of, like, okay, Turf Wars is starting and we're not telling you anything about Avatar comics, and then, okay, they make the announcement that there will be more Avatar comics, but it felt like there was way too long of a gap, that it almost is going to mean that we're in the same position with Korra next year, where we know Iron Co. isn't staying on board past the end of Turf Wars. They're going to need a new artist if they want to continue on Korra comics, and then they haven't said if they are going to continue on Korra comics. And it's those sort of things that they need to answer early, as soon as possible going forward. Confirm if there will be a second Korra comic series, and do it as soon as possible, because I think, in a way, that's kind of what we need going forward, is just a sense of, like, knowing well before another series ends that there is going to be something to follow that up immediately. That, obviously, I get not wanting to announce, like, oh yeah, here's, like, 17 different Avatar comic series that are starting in the next year. But right now, it's just one, and maybe keeping track of, like, oh, there might be another one starting next year, so 2 kind of things to keep track of. I don't think people will mind that much if you kind of announce that, like, okay, we have a plan, we're going to, expand things out, we're going to launch, maybe 2 more Avatar comic series or Korra comic series over the course of next year. I don't think you're going to confuse people that much. It, again, all depends on how you communicate it, but it just feels like it's so separate that, like, for some reason, Dark Horse can only focus on one book at a time. And so, getting back to the idea of what this video is kind of really about, the one-shot stories is like, yeah, look how popular most of those free comics have been. And they've been small, little stories. More of them, please. And even if you maybe don't want to, if they have some sort of a rule in their deal with Nickelodeon where they just don't release single issues outside of Free Comic Book Day, then this is probably where you should start planning for, like, another Lost Adventures type thing. Have it be some sort of an anthology, a kind of compendium type thing, where it is a collection of smaller stories set at various different points in the universe, especially now where you have 2 clear sections of the universe to deal with. You have your Avatar timeline, you have your Korra timeline, but you also now have, because the Avatar timeline is also expanded now into, like, the comic stuff post the series, you can tell extra stories during the series, you can tell extra stuff that's happened in between the comic series, and then, of course, you can even jump back into, like, Wan's time and maybe tell a story that we don't know about from there. And then I think people would very much appreciate it if you even went into, like, here's something else that happened in Karuk's life, or Kyoshi, that sort of thing. You have so many options with that. And it would give an opportunity, obviously, to bring more writers, more artists on board for Avatar comics, and really kind of open the door to, like, seeing where things are now. Because it almost feels like The Lost Adventures is, like, this forgotten comic that's Dark Horse's first Avatar comic release. And it feels like they just have completely gotten away from that, and that we're never going to go back to anything along those lines. Whereas, in a way, I think that's something like that, a Lost Adventures 2, updated now with some Korra stuff in it, covering the Avatar stuff that we want, I think that's almost exactly what we need going forward. Because as excited as I think most people are about the Avatar comic coming next year, we obviously don't know really anything about what the story is about. We can't assume that this is going to cover all the stuff that we want to be covered in this timeline, filling the gaps in these characters' lives. They still, from the designs that we've got so far, still feel quite young, so it doesn't seem like it's going to be too substantial of a time skip. So we're not going to be covering the ground in maybe the way we wanted to. So use an anthology book like The Lost Adventures to cover some of that ground. Tell those stories that maybe it'd be too much of a side plot, too much of a side distraction to tell in the middle of one of these stories. If you don't want to show Aang getting the other Sky Bison, finding the other Sky Bison, where Air Temple Island and the idea for it comes from, tell it in a story like that. Those are the sort of things that I think we really need going forward. More one-shot stories that don't have to be super linked into this current comic format that we have, which I think is becoming a little stale, in part just because the format seems to be more limiting than kind of helping in a way. And especially with us not knowing why it's always set like that, it's pretty all over the place, kind of up in the air really what's going on. So I'm going to end the video there. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are, what you want to see going forward with the Avatar comics. Do you agree with me that we do need kind of more of these kind of just one-off releases, whether they do them as collections, whether they do them as just individual issues? Would you like to see more stuff be done with comics that can be shorter and more just super focused, directed, like a Friends for Life or those free comics? That's what I really want to see a discussion on in the description, in the comment section below. Because that's, I think, my fear in a way for 2018 for Avatar, is that, okay, we're getting the end of Turf Wars and we'll probably get the first part of the new Avatar comic, but will it really be an improvement over what we got this year, which it's fair to say has been it was a fairly disappointing year for story content, and I think we need something else to add on to that to really make the year really good for Avatar content. So that's the discussion. So in the comments again, let me know what your thoughts are. Thanks for watching, and bye.